Hello, everybody, and welcome to the very first episode ever of the Golden Hour Film Podcast. My name is Harry Bailey, and I am joined by my guest host, Shane Mulvaney.
Hello, everyone.
Guest host? You're my co-host. Don't know why I called you my guest host, but we've started this too many times that we're just gonna keep going. So this is our first ever episode. Today we are covering Rebecca, which we'll talk about why we're covering it very shortly. In the meantime, you can find this podcast on YouTube, on Spotify, on iTunes, wherever you listen to your podcast, that's no problem. But if you want to watch the video format, you can only find us on YouTube. Our YouTube channel is just called the Golden Hour Film Podcast. And we'll be doing shorts on TikTok, Instagram Reels, YouTube Shorts, all that jazz as well. Just clipping up the podcast. I don't know, we might make other videos in the future. For now, the plan is the podcast. And Shane, why don't you tell us a little bit about what the podcast is about and what people have to look forward to coming up.
So we're starting off with 1940s Hitchcock, starting off with Rebecca, as Harry said. And basically what we're aiming to achieve with the podcast is basically just to try and bring older films to a new audience. So a lot of people that I talk to, and I think probably Harry has the same issue, is that people that we talk to don't really watch a lot of older films, black and white films. As soon as they hear something's in black and white, they don't really want to watch it, or they don't really have any interest. And just as from our point of view, that's kind of a shame. It's great. Newer films are great. Going to the cinema is great, but there's a lot of great stuff when it comes to older stuff. So we just want to try and maybe encourage people to check out an older film every now and then. It doesn't have to be every single film we talk about, but you know, if you listen to one of these episodes and you like the sound of it, check it out.
Yeah, so with Rebecca, we're talking about one of both me and Shane's favourite film directors ever, Alfred Hitchcock, and what is somehow his only ever Best Picture winner. We'll talk about that in just a moment. But this is a bit of a landmark film in many ways. It's Hitchcock's first film in America. It's his first collaboration with David O. Selznick, who was like the producer at the time. He's just coming off the back of Gone with the Wind, which was the biggest movie ever made at the time. He's got plenty of other credits to his name, King Kong, just to name another one. Hitchcock, yeah, it's his only ever Best Picture win. Some people attribute that to the fact that he is co-signed here by O. Selznick. For me, I could probably think of maybe 6 or 7 Hitchcock films that I prefer. I don't think it's his best. It's certainly not the most Hitchcock film ever made. It's definitely lacking his dry, witty sense of humor, and it's not much of a murder mystery, more just a gothic romance gone wrong. But it's a great film nonetheless. We're going to talk about it now, of course. So, just before the film, it was obviously Hitchcock's first ever time dipping his toes into the American pond, but it wasn't actually supposed to be Hitchcock's first American film. Selznick had actually signed on Hitchcock to make Titanic. Yes, the film that we ended up getting 50-ish years later was supposed to come out in 1940. The film was set to star Paulette Goddard, who was the main actress in both Modern Times and The Great Dictator, but due to some complaints from a cruise liner company, the film never got made, even though Selznick allegedly wanted to actually sink a full-on cruise liner in the film, which would have looked amazing, but hey, instead we get to see Selznick and Hitchcock burn down a huge gaff instead, so you know we still get to see that, which is great. The film was a massive commercial success. It was a huge critical success. It was Hitchcock's biggest critical success up until that point. Obviously it's his only Best Picture winner, but with a budget of $1.29 million, which at the time was obviously a fair wad of cash, it grossed $6 million worldwide. It also won a few other Oscars. Bizarrely, Hitchcock's films won very few Oscars, like across his entire career, but it won Best Black and White Cinematography. That was George Barnes, who also was the cinematographer on Spellbound, which is another 40s Hitchcock film we will be covering at some point on the pod. And yeah, the film is loved by many people. Mainly Mrs. Danvers is loved by many people. She was voted AFI, the American Film Institute's 31st greatest villain of all time. Personally, is she a villain? I'm not so sure. We'll talk about that in a bit. The film is a adaptation of Daphne du Maurier's book Rebecca. It's one of many Hitchcock adaptations of Daphne du Maurier's books. and it is definitely, allegedly, Daphne du Maurier's favourite adaptation that Hitchcock made. She was quoted as saying that she was delighted with it, which, she wasn't with The Birds. Also, Jamaica Inn was another Hitchcock adaptation of du Maurier's works. And that Titanic film was also meant to be an adaptation of the du Maurier book on the Titanic. Jamaica Inn was Hitchcock's last film before this, his last British film, and I think it's kind of overhated. It's got pirates, which is fun. But anyway, let's talk about Rebecca. So, if anybody wants to watch this film, we're talking about getting people into older films. This is accessible for free legally on YouTube. So, it's it's a good jumping off point, I think. It's not Hitchcock's most challenging film, but it's definitely a lot for people to sink their teeth into. Anyway, the film opens with, for me, one of the most iconic opening lines ever, and I can't really attribute this to Hitchcock. Obviously, it comes from the film, but "Last night I dreamt I was in Manderley again" goes so hard. It is such a great opening line. And of course, in that horrible remake, which I'm sure Shane will tear apart later, they even messed that up by calling back to it at the end. Anyway, let's not talk about the remake just yet. But we see Manderley in the opening shot of the film, totally shrouded in darkness, which instantly for me brought two things to mind. One, because I've seen this film before, the mirroring with the end, with the last shot where it's very much not in shadows, but we'll talk about that later without spoiling anything just yet. But also, Hitchcock spent a lot of his time in the 20s in Germany learning German Expressionism. He really wanted to make this like a Gothic, noirish romance, like a real true adaptation of the book. And I think he achieves it. And one of his biggest achievements in this film is his use of shadows. And the first shot of Manderley being shrouded in darkness, we know nothing about Manderley. Our lead character, who, like in the book, doesn't have a name except for Mrs. De Winter, which, is that really her name? Is she really Mrs. De Winter? There's all sorts to unpack there. I don't really know what to call her. Do I just call her Joan Fontaine's character? Do I call her the narrator, which is how she's addressed in the book? Joan Fontaine's character, which is what we'll call her for this, or just Joan Fontaine, she is the assistant to Mrs. Van Hopper, who is basically an older lady with a lot of cash who can afford to pay someone for their company. Joan Fontaine's character, is she that great company? I don't know. Well, her parents are dead, which is why she's in this predicament. She's all by her lonesome and she needs some cash, but she wants to travel. So she's traveling the world with Miss Van Hopper. She's currently in Monte Carlo, where she meets Maxim de Winter, played by Laurence Olivier, who in this film basically just Laurence Olivier's it up, and I like that. I like Laurence Olivier. I think he's great in certain films, and he gives a very Laurence Olivier performance here. If you like Laurence Olivier, you'll definitely like him in this film for sure. I think Hitchcock does a great job of the whole whirlwind romance thing quite well. It literally gets called a whirlwind romance. It doesn't feel forced or rushed. It just feels like a fast romance, but he packs in the first 25 minutes of the film with loads of dates, loads of interactions, and unlike in the book, the remake decides to do this big embarrassing she gets rejected at dinner because she's not a lady thing, because she's not of their class. Do you get it? Yeah, no, it's blatantly obvious. There's no nuance in that film and I hate it. Whereas Hitchcock, in a much better way, just has a vase spill on her, and Maxim de Winter, who's already encountered her twice now, invites her over for dinner and gets to know her.
Yeah, I totally agree. And actually, the first time we see Mr. Maxim de Winter, he's on top of a cliff, and the new Mrs. de Winter, who we, again, as Harry said, whose name we don't know, she thinks he's about to kill himself, and the reasons for this kind of they unspool as the film goes. So psychologically, in a way, it is a whirlwind romance, but the very first time we see them, they're kind of at loggerheads. He certainly doesn't really take an instant liking to her. So as the next kind of the first act unfolds and they start to get to know each other better, the romance really does work well, and that's something I can't say I've always enjoyed in Hitchcock films. Certainly some of his earlier films, the romance kind of feels just a bit simplistic, whereas in this, obviously helped by Daphne du Maurier's novel, he certainly it just works a lot better. You know, there's chemistry there between Laurence Olivier and John Fontaine. John Fontaine in particular is very charming character, and Laurence Olivier doesn't exude when you're playing like a richer character, like a man of wealth. He can kind of exude kind of like a just an arrogance. He doesn't really do that, especially when he's interacting with John Fontaine's character. So yeah, as Harry was saying, the romance works a lot. Works really well. And then once the news of the engagement is presented to Mrs. Van Hopper, you can see that she's kind of her first instinct is, oh no, she doesn't really want to hear about it because that's her help out gone. Like she's gonna have to figure something else out. It's not about being happy for the new couple, the newlyweds. She's just thinking about herself, so you can get that kind of difference in how the wealth is presented. And then, as Harry was saying, I'm going to tear the portrayal of Mrs. Van Hopper to pieces in the remake, because you have such a great actress in Anne Dowd, and she's resorted to absolute nothing dialogue. I mean, it's ridiculous what she has to work with in that film. But for now, we'll stick with the original, and I'll pass back over to Harry.
Yeah, and in the original as well, I have it in my notes. It's one of my favorite shots in the film is this pan to Mrs. Van Hopper's face when she turns around to discover that her helper is in fact who the great Maxim de Winter is marrying. It's this great shot where the way Hitchcock frames it and has blocked it is that our narrator, who, if anything, has nothing to do with this scene, in the eyes of, literally in the eyes of Mrs. Van Hopper, comes in with her back to her, doesn't see her there. Maxim de Winter says, listen, I'm getting married. Mrs. Van Hopper is like, wow, that's amazing. To who? And he points. And as she turns around, instead of how bad films would do it, where they just cut to her and show our narrator, our protagonist, no, Hitchcock pans to the face of Mrs. Van Hopper, instead getting her full emotions, her reaction, again signifying the class difference in how she looks, or looks down on our narrator in a far more nuanced and less shoving it down your throat way than that god awful remake. I'm going to really try not to just say how bad the remake is every time we talk about everything that's good about the original, but it is just one particular thing that the remake does absolutely terribly, which is why we keep talking about it. We won't talk about it for the whole podcast, I promise, but yeah, the remake does this really poorly. So then the newlyweds, after they get married, it's kind of funny as well because Maxim de Winter actually forgets the proof of marriage after they get married. Is he even thinking about his marriage right now, or is he just glad that he's not alone? Who knows at this point anyway. But I really like how when they then get to Manderley for the first time for our new Mrs. De Winter, it is lashing. Bit of pathetic fallacy there, guys. They've gone to this wonderful sunny Monte Carlo to where basically everything's about to go tits up. And I love how the staff and Mrs. Danvers, who is just amazing, Judith Anderson, incredible performance, one of my favourite performances in a Hitchcock film. How Mrs. Danvers is introduced by basically forcing the staff to do this big introduction to the new Mrs. De Winter, and Mrs. De Winter is proper windswept and drenched and does not look anything like she has up until this point in the film. She literally looks her worst, and this is how she is introduced to the staff, and most importantly, this is how she's introduced to Mrs. Danvers, who for the rest of the film will have the most interesting relationship of the film, other than maybe Mrs. Danvers and Rebecca's relationship, but Rebecca's not actually in this film because she's dead. But the most interesting on-screen relationship for me is definitely between Mrs. Danvers and our narrator, Joan Fontaine, whatever you want to call her, because Judith Anderson, you want to talk about putting in a performance into every scene. Every scene she is in, she fills that scene with atmosphere, with so much. Her dialogue is great, don't get me wrong, but her performance is so good, and I'm going to try and really hone in on the particular scenes where she's at her best, because some of the scenes where Judith Anderson is just head and shoulders above everybody else, it is incredible. She is so good in this film.
The basic example of that would be the scene where Rebecca finally realizes that she's against her, that Mrs. Danvers is against her. She doesn't want this marriage to go on. She doesn't want her to be at Manderley. And it's just a terrifyingly ferocious performance. Um, Again, Kristen Scott Thomas in the remake, not to keep harping back in the remake, but she's a great actress. What she has to work with is just very, very little. Um, you know, the film almost seems preoccupied at times. The remake, that is Ben Wheatley's remake. It's like it's almost too preoccupied with the class elements of it. It almost feels like you're watching an episode of Downton Abbey. It's like it's all about upstairs, downstairs. That's not what people want to watch in Rebecca. They just want to watch this clash between these two women. These how is this marriage working? Yeah, people don't want to watch that in a film about Rebecca. They want to watch this this clash between these two women, Mrs. Danvers and the new Mrs. De Winter. You don't want to see this class element nonsense. Like, it's obviously a big underlying part of the novel, but the remake makes it too overt. It's too preoccupied with it at times, and it does not need to be. The material is good enough that you don't need to do that. And Hitchcock's film proves that, you know?
Yeah, one thing that Hitchcock's film actually adds to the novel, which is great as well, but again, in a way less obvious way than the remake, is the sleepwalking with Mrs. Danvers just kind of lurking around the corridors. That's all Hitchcock. That's all Hitchcock, baby. There's no demore in that. And again, the way he lights these corridors, the way the shadows are looming over everyone, it's so cool. It's so gothic. It's so just class. German expressionism is great. Don't get me wrong. If anyone wants any recommendations, feel free to ask a few recommendations in the comments. I'll be active in there. Don't you worry. I'll throw some recommendations your way. But I love the way German expressionist films are lit, and the people who took from that and then almost enhanced it are clear. And Hitchcock is one of those guys. The way every corridor shot in this is just drenched in shadows is so cool. And even just the building, the way Manderley looks, the windows, the large open space in the middle with the stairway where it's almost like serving a lamb to the slaughterhouse at the end. It's laid out and designed so perfectly. The set design is incredible. This Manderley house is so great. I love it so much. It is one of those great instances where a set or a location is a character in the film. Manderley is one of the most interesting characters in the film, and it's a house.
In a way, Manderley is the main character of the film. The whole plot revolves around it. It's all about Mrs. Danvers does not want the new Mrs. De Winter at Manderley. She doesn't want her to replace Rebecca. She doesn't believe that Manderley should be in the hands of someone from a lower, supposed lower class. And this is where the bastardization of the remake really comes into focus, because the original has a kind of underlying kind of romance subplot between Mrs. Danvers and Rebecca. There's maybe like, is she fixated on Rebecca? Was there something happened there, or was it more just in her head? And then the remake just goes and it tries to make it like a mother daughter figure relationship. That undermines the power of Manderley just so much, because Mrs. Danvers is in charge of Manderley, really running Manderley. She obviously answers to the new Mrs. De Winter, but when you add in that subplot, it completely makes everything fall apart. But coming back to what you were saying about how Manderley looks, the remake just looks so fake. Like,
Yeah, it's
the
awful.
the interiors look great, but once you take it outside of the house to the exteriors, the land, it just looks like proper CGI nonsense. And even in those areas where it's not CGI, where it's real, it actually still looks fake. I mean, you're talking about a film from 80 years ago. It looks so much more real. It looks so much more alive. It just proves that, the whole point of this podcast, as I said at the start, is to kind of recommend older films, that things like costuming, things like location, they obviously come set design, they obviously all come into play, and it's insane how much more Hitchcock gets out of the potential of the story than the remake does. I mean, not to keep it's this podcast is about the original, but you can't not talk about the remake as well, and it pales in comparison. It really does.
Yeah, and with Manderley and Mrs. Danvers moving along a little bit in the narrative, when we get to the scene where the new Mrs. De Winter is really trying to acclimatize herself to Manderley, she answers the phone. Someone calls her Mrs. De Winter, and she said, "Oh no, Mrs. De Winter has been dead for a while." And then Mrs. Danvers catches her saying that, and then Mrs. Danvers comes in, and Hitchcock shoots it where it's looking up at Danvers and down on the new Mrs. De Winter. It's basic stuff, but it's brilliant, and it somehow doesn't happen that much in film anymore. I don't understand it. Where we are literally looking up at the person of the higher class and down on the person of the lower class, or at least this is how the film wants us to believe they are. And then we get the part of the scene where she asks the new Mrs. De Winter to read through the menu. She says it's fine. That was a loaded question because there's a blank at the end of the menu. She was testing her to see if she actually read it, to see if she's actually doing her ladylike duties, and she's not because it's all too much for her. And again, Mrs. Danvers says, "Oh well, the old Mrs. De Winter used to get really invested in choosing the sauces and all that sort of thing." There's so much packed into that scene, and it's shot so perfectly. It's constructed perfectly. It's one of my favorite scenes in the whole film. It highlights the class differences. It highlights how obsessed Mrs. Danvers was with Rebecca. It highlights how out of her depth the new Mrs. De Winter is, and how Mrs. Danvers looks down on her, and how she almost has to look up at Mrs. Danvers, because although Mrs. Danvers is against her, if she kind of does what Mrs. Danvers says, it is easier for her to blend in, but it's all too much for her. She can't help but lie as well, because then she breaks the piece of china, which is a thing that seems so nonchalant at the time, and then we come back to it because she breaks it and stuffs it in the drawer, whereas in the remake it all happens in that one scene, and there's no tension, there's no build up there. There's so much packed into that one scene that even if you're not going to watch the film and you're not sure if it's for you, just look up that one scene, and in that one scene you will see enough of this film to know that it's worth a watch. And Hitchcock packs each scene with these like clouds over each character, because especially towards the end you see each character and you hear what they're saying, but you know what they really mean and you know what their real intentions are. And most characters know things about other characters that they don't, because the nuance in this film is handled so well. Hitchcock is a genius, and yeah, I can see why it won Best Picture. I do think Grapes of Wrath is a better film from that year. That's just me personally. But I do see why it won Best Picture, because there is so much excellence in this film. It is so good. For me, it's definitely Hitchcock's best film up until this point.
Yeah, as far as his best films, I definitely think this is his best film up to this point, same as you. The 39 Steps in, I think it was 1937 or 38, that's worth a watch as well. The Lady Vanishes is also worth a watch. The original, The Man Who Knew Too Much, I'm not a huge fan of, but if you end up watching the remake of that, his own remake, by the way, remade his own film from 20 years earlier in the 50s, if that's something that you end up watching, watch the remake, so just so you can compare the two, just as we've been kind of comparing the two Rebeccas here today.
Yeah, the only thing I'll say about that though is with the original, although it's definitely not as good a film, I do think Peter Lorre is a better villain.
Absolutely, 100%. Yeah.
Peter Lorre's a great actor. If you're not really into your older films or your German films, watch some of Peter Lorre's best stuff. He's fascinating.
There's a film called M, directed by Fritz Lang from 1930 maybe, in and around there. His villain in that is like iconic. I mean, all-time villain for performance. German film, German expression. So.
Literally iconic. The size of his eyes.
Yeah, it's like, in a way, it's you can see the influence that kind of performance would have on a lot of modern films. a lot of modern villains. You can just tell. You can just tell that they've watched that film and they've watched his performance.
Yeah, another good one from the 30s, I mentioned it at the top, is Hitchcock's last English film or British film, which is Jamaica Inn, another Daphne du Maurier novel adaptation. People don't really like it. I don't really know why. It's one of Hitchcock's sillier films. Maybe that's why. Maybe people just need their Hitchcock to be super serious. But it's just a nice different one. There's pirates, there's undercover agents, there's all sorts of stuff going on there. And again, it's another one of those films where the location is the main character. Jamaica Inn is such an interesting place. Such interesting people go in there. And I feel like a few people will definitely relate to it, because if you go down to your local pub, you will see some people who look like they came from Jamaica Inn. There is some dodgy fellas in that pub. So then getting back into Rebecca, after that great sequence, we get, it's just one of my favourite lines of dialogue. It's not necessarily from one of the best scenes in the film. Just the line, "She just adored Rebecca." It's a great line, but also Hitchcock enhances it so much again with just a simple pan and a swelling of the music, because this is where our narrator, Joan Fontaine, realizes that there's actually nothing she can do to impress Mrs. Danvers, because there is clearly some sort of obsession going on there between Mrs. Danvers and Rebecca. And this is where Joan Fontaine sort of starts to kind of toughen up a bit in Manderley. She realizes she won't impress Mrs. Danvers, so she just tries to, live her best life. So her and Maxim de Winter they watch a clip show of some of their dates, because they're that wealthy that even in 1940 they can afford to have someone filming their dates for them. And it's after this where we realize, or we remember, that she broke that piece of china. So this is where Frith comes in and says bit of stuff, and then Miss Danvers comes in, and then they realize that this piece of china has gone missing. They leave, and yeah, this is where the dodgy relationship vibes really start coming in, because as soon as the new Mrs. De Winter confides in Maxim and says, "I'm so sorry, I broke that, but I hid it because I was so embarrassed," he calls them back in and basically tells them out straight, even though he knows how terrified of them his new wife is, because he doesn't seem to have any real caring or compassion towards other people's emotions, particularly his own wife. So he doesn't really care. He just wants to get this, if we're talking breaking the fourth wall, he just wants to get this scene out of the way. Yeah. So he's just like, yeah, no, she broke it, she's an idiot, she hit it, God, isn't she stupid? And although the vibes are definitely there already, this is one of the first really blatant, in-your-face examples of this really toxic, coercive relationship where Laurence Olivier's character basically just tries to control his new wife. And because she is so out of sorts, because she's still trying to get used to Manderley, she kind of blindly follows everything he says, regardless of how it makes her look or appear to other people, because he doesn't care either. He doesn't care how she looks to other people. He's a bit of a dick, is our Maxim de Winter. I'm not a big fan of him. Also, just another example of a great scene where Hitchcock uses shadows, because as soon as Mrs. De Winter says that she's not ladylike, and she doesn't like that they're gonna now gossip about her, the shadow that then goes on Maxim de Winter's face, just to show how seething with anger he is so good. Good stuff, Hitchcock. He's going places.
He's got a future.
Yeah, this young upstart Alfred Hitchcock, he's got some more up his sleeve, I can tell you that much.
Yeah, I'll tell you. No, Laurence Olivier is really good. Just at playing the subtle shifts, they're not even that detectable. At the start of the film, like we said, there's kind of a jovialness almost to his performance, certainly a laconicness, where he's not really that bothered too much by how he comes across. You can tell he's obviously affected by something, which we later find out is Rebecca's death. But the romance with Joan Fontaine's character is really well played. But as we get into the second act, we come back to Manderley, and the plot starts to unfold. More and more controlling, coercive behaviour, as you said, starts to be displayed. So, again, to come back to the remake, if we're talking about the Army Hammer out of it all, leaving aside real life issues, shall we say, and just focusing on his performance, there's nothing there. I mean, there's nothing there. The guy,
it's still bad.
And the guy is just like, he could not look less interested. I don't know if this was like certain things in real life was going on with him, but it's just, there's nothing there.
Oh yeah, no, he was going through his divorce at the time, so God love Army Hammer, that poor fella. Whatever happened to him?
Selling timeshares, I hear. I think he actually is, but anyway, leave that aside.
So after this, poor Elle Mrs. De Winter, because at this point I still feel sorry for her. She's distraught. She doesn't really know what to do. She knows she'll never be Rebecca. So what does she do? She goes to Rebecca's room, which Mrs. Danvers has kept absolutely pristine since Rebecca's death. Which again, unlike in the remake where they literally maybe say that word for word, is just a thing that just happens, that you just see. It doesn't need to be explained to you word for word. So when she goes into the room, she's basically messing with Rebecca's stuff again. I don't think it's the first time she's kind of messed with Rebecca's stuff. And this is probably my favorite scene as far as music goes. The way the music swells at the points of tension in this, and the way it quietens whenever Mrs. Danvers is delivering her absolutely brilliant speeches, her excellent monologues, where she is talking down to the new Mrs. De Winter. It just shows two things. It shows how great Judith Anderson is. She's just absolutely class. But it also shows that Hitchcock knows that he has all of these tools at his disposal, and he pulls the trigger when necessary. The music is definitely like there in the film, but at the most important scenes is where the music is at its best, and that's just another great touch. Obviously, you can't just attribute all of the music to just Hitchcock. The composer had a pretty big part to play in that, but it's just an excellent example of excellent filmmaking, to be honest. I really enjoyed it.
And again, coming back to the remake, I'm sorry to keep harping on about how bad the remake is, but there was these like weird folk music. It's so bad.
As do I. It's awful. It sucks.
It's so terrible. There's like weird folk music, like interstitials playing over a scene, and it just comes out of nowhere. I mean, it's not like a folk music kind of film. You know what I mean? Like, in a weird way, this is like a good episode or a good film to have as our first episode, because, again, the whole point of the podcast is talking about why you should watch older films, or why you should at least try to check out older films. You have a really great adaptation of a book, which is an older film, and then you have a really shitty adaptation of the same book from however many 80 years later. So just because a film is more modern doesn't mean that it's going to be it's going to have and it might have more of a budget. It doesn't mean it's going to have better costume design, better set design, better acting, better script, better direction. It just doesn't mean that. It's night and day when you compare the two.
Yeah, and in this scene in the original, we get some of the best stuff in the film, because this is where we get some serious layers to Mrs. Danvers as a character, because Mrs. Danvers, kind of like us, has been waiting to really get into how and why she's so obsessed with Rebecca, and she does. She pours her heart out. And we also get that great scene where Mrs. Danvers is like this shadowy figure against the curtains, which are like really illuminated. That is one of the best scenes in the film. I wouldn't be surprised if I use it for the thumbnail, guys, on YouTube. I might not, but we'll see. Although YouTube loves faces in its thumbnail, so I might have to do that. Anyway, this is where I really start to actually sympathize with Mrs. Danvers, and this is where I kind of have a bit of a bone of contention to pick with the AFI, giving her the 31st best villain of all time. She's not just a villain. There's so many layers and nuances to basically every character in this film, and she's probably the most interesting and layered of the lot, because after she basically pours her heart out as to how much she loves Rebecca, Joan Fontaine's character says, "Well, I am Mrs. De Winter now," and basically just shuts her down. Just like, everything you told me about why you love Rebecca, fuck it. I run this city now, and it's where we start to get, to use a wrestling term, we get a bit of a heel turn coming with Joan Fontaine, I feel, because she starts to really buy into Maxim De Winter's. She really starts to drink the Kool-Aid, and on the flip side, we really get to see how nuanced and tender the relationship was between Danvers and Rebecca, and how it basically had to be kept hidden, because there's one moment, which we'll get to in a bit, where, yeah, it's pretty clear and obvious that, for me anyway, there was more than just friendship going on there between Danvers and Rebecca. If you were to consider Rebecca as like a character in this film, which obviously she's a character in the film, but you know what I mean. It's like probably the best ghost film without a ghost, by the way. But it's such an interesting relationship, and it's particularly towards the end where we really start to find things out, and this is the first scene where we really find stuff out between Danvers and Rebecca, and the response that our protagonist gives us is, yeah, pretty cold-hearted, because at the end of the day, Mrs. Danvers, even as far as the narrator is aware, lost her best friend. How long ago was it? Was it a year ago? It was like almost exactly a year ago, wasn't it? So like, she's still reeling from that, and our new
Yeah,
Mrs.
it's about a
Winter
year.
doesn't care. There's this. How are you guys meant to ever work as a relationship if you're just gonna shut her down at her most tender, emotional, expressive moment in the film so far? Yeah, bitch.
So I'm gonna stick up for the new Mrs. De Winter a little bit here.
Ooh.
Well, Danvers has been a bit of a thorn in her side up to this point. Why would she kind of show any willingness to kind of meet her halfway? Danvers hasn't shown that to her, you know.
Yeah, I suppose. But with the whole Mrs. Danvers saying, I've been waiting to tell you about why I love Rebecca so much,
That's true. Yeah,
and then Mrs. De Winter being like, okay, I'm really interested, and then afterwards being like, actually, I wasn't interested in anything you just said.
that's true. But again, we'll come to the next scene, or the next a little bit later. But any sympathy I personally had for Danvers goes fairly quickly, I would say.
Yeah, fair enough. Fair enough. She does some crazy stuff towards the end. But at this point, anyway, I'm
At
like,
this, yeah,
Mrs. Danvers, you're more layered than what
very
people have
layered.
you to be.
Danvers and Rebecca, two of the most three-dimensional characters probably
Yeah.
around that you could find, really. I mean, Rebecca's not even on screen. She never appears, obviously. As you said, she's pretty much a ghost. But, like, you feel like you know everything about her. You feel like you know her intimately. You feel like you know Danvers intimately. You definitely know the relationship that they had intimately, whatever you want to read into it, whether it was a romantic relationship or whether it was a little bit more platonic. You still know intimately what that relationship was and how much certainly Rebecca meant to Danvers.
Yeah, and Danvers definitely gets her revenge not long after because, well, first of all, we get a really interesting little shot that I really liked, where the Manderley Ball is coming up, and our new Mrs. De Winter doesn't know what she's gonna wear. And just to highlight how she really has no idea who she is. I mean, we're literally talking about a character who doesn't even have a name. She doesn't even have her own name. We don't know what her maiden name is.
Yeah,
She doesn't even know who she is. So when we see the sketches of what she's going to wear, they could not be more different to each other. She hasn't a clue who she is, what she wants to be, what she wants to look like. There was like a night costume, like a Renaissance ball gown with like big fluffy hair. And then even Mrs. Danvers comes in and says, "Oh, I found all these sketches." Like, this girl has no idea who she is or what she wants to be. And Manderley is not helping it. And Maxim de Winter is certainly not helping it.
absolutely. And to touch back on what we talked about earlier, the class elements, like I said, the remake, not to keep harping back on the remake, it's a bit too, in my opinion, concerned with the class elements. What the original does really well is it deals with it, but it doesn't. It's not shoving it in your face. It's not in your face. This Manderley Ball is the perfect example of that because she's just out of her depth. The new Mrs. De Winter, Joan Fontaine, and you can see that, but she's not. It doesn't feel like a Channel 5 Downton Abbey episode or whatever. It's just in her facial expressions. Joan Fontaine is really really good. She's trying to be assertive. She's trying to be the woman of the house. She's trying to be what Maxim she thinks Maxim wants. And as we'll come to see in a little short while, she just completely keeps getting undermined by Mrs. Danvers.
So yeah, then we get to the ball gown scene, the literal lamb being served for the slaughter. Interestingly, in the novel, it's just straight up Mrs. Danvers tells her, "Oh, you should wear this," whereas in the film, it's a bit more subdued. Like she suggests it. She doesn't
Yeah,
tell her, "Oh, you should wear this." It's pretty good. Good stuff, Hitchcock.
yeah, it's
So
very subtle,
basically,
very subtle.
yeah, definitely. And at this ball, the new Mrs. De Winter comes down the stairs wearing the exact outfit that Rebecca is wearing in her portrait above the staircase. And as she comes down, she's got this big old smile on her face. Everything's going well. And as soon as Maxim De Winter turns around, he tells her anything else is better than that. Go get changed. And it's like, oh dear God. Because essentially, she has been served on a plate in Rebecca's clothes, and everyone's like, wow, you look just like Rebecca. But you're not Rebecca. You'll never be Rebecca. And the visual imagery is great. The it's a heartbreaking scene. You really do feel for Joan Fontaine's character here. And at this point, Hitchcock and the gang are just hitting straight home runs because we go from that scene to this scene to then the scene where she goes up and confronts Mrs. Danvers, and it is again one of the best scenes in the entire film.
And just to touch upon that Manderley Ball scene as well, it touches you even more because earlier in the film, Maxim tells Rebecca he doesn't care what she wears. He's not trying to control what she wears. As we go on to find out, that's not really true. He's subtly planting little seeds. He subtly is trying to control her. He does care, and this is the most overt example of that, where that's why she's so shocked.
Yeah, so then we get the scene where probably the most famous images of this film come from, where John Fontaine's character goes up to confront Mrs. Danvers, and Mrs. Danvers, again, just excellence, just pure excellence from Judith Anderson, convinces her, almost convinces her to literally throw herself from the top of Manderley at one point. She is so good in just convincing her that not only are you not Rebecca, not only are you never going to be Rebecca, but what is the point in you actually existing if you're just going to try and be Rebecca and never achieve that? And it is such a good performance, and we get the incredible shot of Danvers basically looming over Joan Fontaine's character's shoulder as they look out the window. And then, plot twist alert, because a boat has rocked up ashore. And prior to this, I don't actually think we mentioned it, prior to this, Rebecca was presumed to have been found dead because Maxim De Winter identified her body. And now this new ship, with a hole in the middle of it, which was clearly made by someone, not by the rocks or anything, it was made by someone, has just landed ashore. And who is on that ship? Well, Rebecca. We don't see her, but Rebecca.
Yeah, and this is where the film really starts to take another turn. We come across the cottage earlier in the film, so Hitchcock planting little seeds there. Kind of a worn down, dilapidated cottage. Spooky, mysterious, all those suspenseful, all those Hitchcock things. That's Hitchcock planting those seeds, because when we come back to the cottage, then we see Maxim looking spooked about something, and we don't really know why.
Yeah, and then we realise that, yeah, okay, Maxim De Winter, he's not a great husband. Well, we find
No.
out he's much worse than just that, because they go into this seaside cottage when it turns out that that is Rebecca, and it's just the two of them. The new Mrs. De Winter and Maxim De Winter are in there, and Laurence Olivier really Laurence Olivier's it up in this scene in particular. Proper theatre acting, but it's Laurence Olivier, so it's, you know, it's great. And yeah, we find out basically, long story short, Rebecca was not very nice to Maxim De Winter, the poor fella. So when she tripped and fell and hit her head in front of him, he put her on a ship and smashed a big hole in the middle of it and let it sink. Because turns out he hated her. They did not get on at all. This relationship where poor old Maxim De Winter, he just can't be alone because he misses Rebecca so much, it's all fabricated. They hated each other. Why? Well, at this point, it's clear that, well, allegedly Rebecca was getting it on with her cousin, and we'll talk about that in a second, but Laurence Olivier's character, Maxim De Winter, said, you know, if you come back here with your cousin, I'll shoot the two of you. And we also find out about this rumoured trip to the doctor in London, not her own doctor, but a different doctor. And this is where we get into the sort of courtroom element, because with all of this in place, basically, here we are. We have a courtroom scene where Maxim De Winter failed to identify his wife the first time, so that's suspicious. There is a hole in the middle of the boat, so there's clearly a question of foul play, or she intended on killing herself. There is a big hole in the middle of the ship, which is man-made, because either there is foul play here, or Rebecca intended on ending her own life. You have this cousin, who is played really well, actually, by George Sanders, who we'll talk about in The Foreign Correspondent on the next episode. He's a very shady, mysterious character who really comes into play towards the end. And then, because we have all this new information, suddenly we kind of feel like how the new Mrs. De Winter felt when she got to Manderley. There's so much new information coming at us at once that it's so hard to actually try and, on a first watch anyway, try and piece together who's actually telling the truth, what is anybody's motives. And this is where, as I said earlier, these clouds are forming above characters' heads where we know certain things that other characters don't about each character, and they're saying one thing but they mean another thing. And the courtroom scene is pretty interesting, but what's more interesting is the aftermath of this courtroom scene. Yeah, after the court scene, we kind of find out a lot of people's motives. So essentially, the new Mrs. De Winter is now just blindly backing Maxim De Winter with trying to get away with the murder of his wife. The cousin, who is again played by George Sanders, Favel, he has suggested
Favel.
that Maxim De Winter killed her due to their affair, and said that she went to London to see a doctor, which we mentioned before. Favel's theory is that it is because she was pregnant with her and her cousin's child, and that is why Laurence Olivier killed her. So we get this big confrontation, and they all go to the doctor's office. And when we get to the doctor's office, the doctor, played by Leo G. Carroll, who will get name dropped a few times in the podcast because he's in basically every Hitchcock film between the 1940s and 1950s, he says that, drumroll please, there was no Mrs. De Winter who went to him. And this causes a bit of confusion because obviously we have the investigator there and the cousin who is convinced that this is a foul play, this is murder, and that she did it because she was pregnant with her and her cousin's child. The investigator is exploring the possibility that it might be that she actually ended her own life, and he wants to know why would she ever want to end her own life. Maxim De Winter is there to make sure that he can cover whatever comes up in this situation because he knows that he killed her. So it's all sorts of possibilities, and when they find out that there was no Mrs. De Winter who went there, it's kind of confusing until they get him to read all of the patients who went. And there was no Mrs. De Winter there because there was a Mrs. Danvers there. And that for me was the moment where it became official that there was definitely some sort of romantic relationship between the two, because when she was away in London, she was who she wanted to be. She was Mrs. Danvers. She was basically confirming for the audience that her and Mrs. Danvers, it was a symbiotic relationship. They loved each other. It was not one obsessed with the other, it was both obsessed with each other. And it turns out that this Mrs. Danvers, who is actually Rebecca, had cancer. She was not pregnant. She had cancer, which then basically fuels the theory for the investigator that she had cancer and she wanted to end her life for the cancer, and that's it. Maxim De Winter gets away with it, or so he thinks.
Yeah, you can say that again. So Maxim and Frank, his friend and his loyal accomplice, his loyal acquaintance, they're coming back to Manderley. In the distance, though, we see a building on fire, and Maxim realizes it's Manderley. So we come back to Manderley, and it turns out that Mrs. Danvers is on a rampage where she cannot handle the fact that it looks like the new Mrs. De Winter and Maxim are going to live happily ever after in Manderley. So she can't let that happen, so she burns the place to the ground because she'd rather that than see anyone but Rebecca happy in Manderley.
And yeah, this is where the 1940, 2020, and book adaptations, well, the book's not an adaptation, but bear with me for a second, all have pretty interesting takes on how to wrap this whole thing up. The book, it's pretty straight-laced, it's pretty straightforward. Maxim De Winter comes home, finds Manderley is on fire. The end. That's it. With the film, it's very blatantly, it's Mrs. Danvers. You can see her do it, and you can see that she is left inside the building. She is going along with Rebecca, because now that this whole Rebecca case is closed, essentially the very idea of Rebecca is kind of gone because there's no suspicion there. Everything's out in the open. We know what happened, and it's out of the courts, so there's nothing that Mrs. Danvers can do. So she feels that her best place to be is with Rebecca, so she burns down Manderley in one final bad bitch move and takes it from Maxim De Winter because, well, she thinks he doesn't deserve it. I also would agree with her. And that is the end of the film. In the glorious remake, I think in an homage to the film where it opens, or we first meet Maxim De Winter, standing atop a cliff, Mrs. Danvers sets Manderley on fire. Then she has a back and forth with the new Mrs. De Winter on a cliff, which is the worst looking scene ever. It is so green screen and awful. And then she jumps off a cliff, and I'm being honest, I think I've jumped off higher cliffs into the sea. Don't really know how that fall killed her, but here we are. And then we get this wonderful extra scene in Cairo on their honeymoon where she tries to tie things up and be like, oh, remember in that opening where it said last night I dreamt I was in Manderley? Well, I'm going to wrap it up and talk about how I dreamt I was in Manderley again. Because nuance is dead and film is dead. No, because the new film's bad. It's just bad and it's very spoon-feedy and I hate it. But no, the way the 1940 film wraps up is pretty cool because, one, they don't have Manderley anymore. So Manderley as a character is gone. Mrs. Danvers as a character is gone. And Rebecca as a character is gone. So basically all the intrigue is gone and we're just left with this couple who don't particularly like each other. And that's kind of funny. But also I like that the final shot is of Manderley on fire and a light because everything's been brought to light, whereas the opening scene, it's all in shadows because we don't know what's happening, because Hitchcock is quite good at mirroring.
And as far as the remake goes, believe it or not, you're right to say it's very green screeny, that cliff scene. The actual psychology behind the scene, I didn't hate. It kind of alludes to things like violence against women, and Of course, they'd kill her because, she was too powerful for them. So obviously a man had to kill her. I can understand where they're coming from. It's like a modern kind of feminist adaptation of that kind of attacking that kind of um, that storyline. So I didn't hate it as much as I hated pretty much the rest of the film. Other than the fact that it looks like absolute shit. But then the whole Cairo nonsense afterwards is just, just no, I'm not having that. Again, pales in comparison to the original, which it's so bittersweet because Manderley, as I said earlier, is pretty much the main character. If not Rebecca, certainly Manderley, certainly Colliers, even though Rebecca isn't even on screen. And then Manderley is Manderley is no longer going to.
It's a house.
It's just a house. I mean, it's burnt to ash, so it's never going to exist again unless Maxim might have the money to build it back up, but it's going to take a long, long time. By which time his marriage to the new Mrs. De Winter might already have crumbled. So Mrs. Danvers might get her wish after all.
And that's Rebecca from 1940, directed by Alfred Hitchcock. As we said, Alfred Hitchcock's only ever film to win Best Picture. Shane, overall, quick summary in a few lines. What did you make of the film?
Definitely Hitchcock's best film up to this point. If you like The 39 Steps or The Lady Vanishes or any of his previous films before 1940, I think you're going to like Rebecca. Like I said earlier, I like the romance elements in the first act, and then it becomes a suspenseful thriller. So it kind of has everything you would want in a Hitchcock film wrapped into one up to this point. So I like it. This is up to this point. It's definitely his best film in my opinion. So I'll give it a 4 out of 5 stars.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I think it's his best film to this point. I do love the Gothic romance, the way it's shot. It's brilliant how it's framed. There's so many scenes of just perfection. I kind of feel like the courtroom and the ending is maybe a little over long personally. Some of it's a little too drawn out, but then the ending's perfect. Like the actual literal end of the film is perfect. I think Judith Anderson gives one of the best performances in a Hitchcock film. She is so good in this film, and I do really like how recognized she gets for it. It is definitely the most talked about part of this film is Mrs. Danvers and her performance, and I think that's definitely worth all the acclaim that it gets because she is incredible in this film. I agree. Yeah, if you want to check us out on Letterboxd and see our reviews, mine's not particularly in depth, but I'm pretty sure I have a previous in depth analysis of this film because I have watched this a couple of times. I also gave this 4 out of 5 stars. If you want to track us on our Letterboxds, I'm sure we'll be making lists and stuff to do with the podcast and how we rank certain things. So make sure to follow us on there, as well as all of our other socials. You can see them at the bottom of the screen, and if you've been following along on YouTube, you can see all of our own socials as well. If you're listening on Spotify or iTunes, well, okay, I'm going to actually have to say them out loud. I've just realised that, because if you're listening, you can't see anything, can you? So, our X, or our Twitter, is at GH Film Podcast. That's at GH Film Podcast. Our Instagram is at Golden Hour Film Pod. That's Golden Hour Film Pod. And on TikTok, where we'll stick our clips or whatever, is at the Golden Hour Film Pod. They're all different because we're a new podcast and we can't afford to buy Twitter handles or anything off people just yet. But in the meantime, that is what we are on all our socials. Thank you so much. And if anybody wants to ask us any questions or give us some recommendations or just have some general film discourse, throw it in our YouTube comments or feel free to send us a few messages on our Instagram or Twitter. Thank you very much. And we'll see you next week.
See you, everyone.